So Jackie Qataliña Schaeffer is an Inupiaq from Kotzebue, Alaska, and she is the Director of Climate Initiatives Program at the Alaska Native Tribal Health Consortium under the Department of Community, Environment, and Health. For decades, she has worked across Alaska, holistically infusing Indigenous knowledge into a variety of sectors she has experience in, including comprehensive planning, energy, housing, water security, sanitation, and climate change adaptation for rural communities. Her passion is to serve the Indigenous people of Alaska and to provide an Indigenous perspective to all of her work, including the importance and recognition of traditional philosophies, knowledge, and worldviews. Her current work includes climate change assessments, community engagement, community relocation oversight, and overseeing the Center for Climate and Health and the Center for Environmentally Threatened Communities within the ANTHC Climate Initiatives Program. Jackie, we are super excited to have you here today. Thank you so much. And yeah, please, once your screen share is all set, take it away.
Okay, thanks so much. Hello, everyone. I want to say good morning because I just am adjusting to my my time change from my travels. So here we go. So thank you for having me. And if you need more information, my contact information will be available at the end. And I'm also going to hop into the breakout session. So if you have specific questions, you could ask me then. If you'd like to learn more about our programs, again, just reach out to me afterwards. So Hiluripin, Vanga Atika Qataliña, Nalagmichiska Jackie Schaeffer. Inupiaq Nirunga Anirunga Kikiktarumi. I am Jackie Qataliña Schaeffer. I am Inupiaq. I was born and raised in the community of Kotzebue, Kikiktaruk, on the northwest coast of Alaska, in a very traditional kind of mixed Indigenous world lifestyle. Half the time in our community of Kotzebue and the other half at our fish camp. Fortunately, very blessed to live in the same area and eat the same foods for over 500 generations in my family. And that really kind of brings me to where we are today, because it's really important that we acknowledge and recognize the people that we serve here at the Alaska Native Tribal Health Consortium. And as an Inupiaq, I really take that to heart. I'm going to share with you a little bit about the Unmet Needs Report. This report was published in January. We released an executive summary last year at Arctic Encounter in Anchorage. And it really is about equitable solutions and delivery systems and processes for our tribes. If you want to learn more about the Tribal Health Consortium, I'm happy to share that with you directly. So again, just reach out. And I'm going to go ahead and go off camera so I could share all my slides. Here we go. And it's not advancing, but here we go. Try this. All right. So the report is a result of collaboration between ANTHC and the State of Alaska Division of Regional and Community Affairs. The purpose of this report, as mentioned before, is to help improve the effectiveness of federal and state government support for Alaska tribal communities to address climate and environmental impacts and threats to infrastructure. This report is focused on infrastructure threats through the lens of erosion, flooding, and permafrost degradation. We realize, and we state in the report, in the executive summary and introduction, that this report is missing a lot of things that are really vitally important and critical gaps that our communities are also facing when it comes to climate change. Two of the recurring themes that since we've published this report is housing, the housing issue, as well as climate impacts to food sovereignty and access to food resources. So we do recognize that. So again, this report focuses on that protection of infrastructure. So legislative and programmatic changes are needed to improve some of the barriers faced by our small rural communities, and the creation of more effective and equitable systems is currently taking place as we have formal discussions with our federal funding partners. We know that Alaska is on the front line of climate change. We are seeing up to 4%, 4% faster climate impacts than anywhere else on the planet. We also house in the Arctic circumpolar north the permafrost, and that is basically the cooling system for the Earth system. So we want to make sure that we not only call out the protection of infrastructure, but help share the dialogue and inform people to really understand the system as a whole. Our intended audience with this report is the US Congress and the White House, as well as federal and state agency leaders and program managers. So we know that it takes policy change to change some of the barriers that are in place, that have been in place since the creation of the United States, that aren't equitable for small communities. And really, Alaska being so far away from Washington, D.C., we see that as also a barrier, because those policies that impact the users in Alaska may not be understood the realities of what's happening to our communities. So we want to make sure that we have that dialogue with everyone and that we share the knowledge. And really, this was one way of sharing the knowledge of the realities that our communities face. Community impacts. We know there are current trends and impacts that exacerbate one issue into other issues. And we at the consortium are looking at this through a public health lens, which climate change impacts not only the infrastructure that our communities need to thrive, but it also is exacerbating health issues that may exist. And we still have a lot of these communities are not located on road systems, so therefore they have that challenge as well. We know that we have increased precipitation. We also have increased wind speeds, the unpredictability, the rising air temperatures. I mean, currently we have a hot air warning here in Alaska through the whole interior, all the way to the Northwest Arctic region. So, you know, the risk of wildfires this time of year is really high. The loss of sea ice, that sea ice was free infrastructure from nature that protected our coastal communities from fall storms. Without that sea ice, we are seeing extreme erosion when that warm water hits the permafrost bluffs, and it basically is just taking off chunks of land and threatening communities and infrastructure along the coast. And then, of course, that adds to the sea level rise. And we know that all of these things are happening 4 times faster than anywhere else on the planet. So I'm going to just share a few images. If you're not familiar, this is Buckland. I will tell you, I talked to somebody in Buckland this year. This year, the ice went out in one day. They had no flooding, which is very unusual. So the unpredictability, now you see this, and it was happening a few years in a row. And so they plan for this, and then it doesn't happen. So we have an issue there, because investment will only go where we actually have documentation of the threat. This is Qataliña. This is water and sanitation infrastructure that was taken out because there was not that sea ice protection to protect this fall storm from pushing that ice and water up onto the shore. This is a home in Schaeffer. This is permafrost degradation. This shows you where the pipe is actually broken, and the house is basically falling off its pilings because that melt is happening. And so this is pretty common in these communities. And we have to also recognize that when it comes to environmental risks, we have everything that's brought out to rural Alaska stays in rural Alaska. So what it does is, when you have all of these compacting threats, it also creates another hazard, which is a waste hazard. And so we need to recognize that as well. The displacement of families is critical. This is Dolly Abraham and her family. They had to move out of their home because of the foundation was impacted by permafrost melt. When you have to displace homes in rural Alaska, you have to understand also that there is a housing crisis in rural Alaska. A lot of the homes were not designed culturally appropriate, environmentally appropriate. They were basically just built as structures for shelter. And so we have aging infrastructure as well as overcrowding and intergenerational living in homes. So in this case, this family has to move in with family members that are already living in an overcrowded home. And so recognizing that as a critical gap when it comes to the threat of infrastructure and housing is exacerbating other issues that already currently exist in the community. Rural Alaskans are really creative. They use whatever they can to try to mitigate these issues. This is where the permafrost is causing foundation issues in Quinnahock at the Head Start program. You can see on the image on the left that it is basically pulling the stairwell away from the building itself. And their way of approaching it on the right is to just use whatever scrap lumber is available to jack up the foundation and hopefully protect it long enough to access funding and have repairs done. This is Shishmaref. This used to be a road. This is what I was talking about with that warm water without the coastal ice. You basically have this water hitting the coast and it just sloughs away that ice-rich soil that is impacted. So we don't know what the trigger effects are because we don't have risk assessments that give us the accurate data of what this is doing for the long term. So we are also standing up a risk assessment program under climate initiatives to really look at what are the risks and how do communities make informed decisions when it comes to this type of climate threat. So currently communities look at what are their options. And so in order to make informed decisions, they need information. And what we don't have is enough data and information and monitoring across the state to really give us that true information that will give us the information needed for long-term decision making. So communities either choose to protect in place, where they protect with a shoreline protection or just upgrading foundations. The challenge there is the housing issues and the drainage in the communities on the Yukon-Kuskokwim Delta is not available. That is something that we have yet to have a funding source to address housing foundations. Or they choose a managed retreat, which they have maybe solid ground behind the community and they're able to hopscotch buildings if they're movable to behind where the threat is. Again, each of these projects are usually a one-off. They're not coordinated efforts by any funding agency. So communities are competing for funding and then they're having to choose what buildings to protect. Or in some cases, like in the case of Newtok and Qataliña, their risk is so high that they have to completely relocate. And so in the case of Newtok, it took almost 8 years of negotiation to do a land exchange with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service because the location on Nelson Island was a refuge. The systems in place are barriers that really just put our communities in a position of one, competing against each other to save their community, or two, not having the privilege of time to negotiate a land exchange that took 8 years. So we have to figure out and work with our federal partners to figure out how we're going to respond to this in the future, because this is only, a handful of communities that we're looking at currently, but what we're seeing is that those threats are increasing, and the more information we get, the more communities are having to do this forced relocation due to climate impacts. This is another graphic from the report. This is just a geographic comparison of what we're dealing with. We are trying to build up our team here at ANTHC. We are currently a staff of about 10, working across the entire state, 229 tribes, and will never be able to have the staff or the capacity to respond to every environmental threat that we're seeing. So this just gives you an example of what we're seeing. We know we have 144 or more, probably up to 150 now, communities that are being impacted by climate. And of those communities, not all of them have to relocate. We see just over a dozen that will need to fully relocate, probably 40 or 50 that will need to do some type of managed retreat, and then the rest have to do some type of protect in place. So the unmet needs, this is something that has been talked about. This report builds off of a couple other reports that were done in the past by both the Bureau of Indian Affairs as well as the Government Accountability Office. the inequitable delivery of services, basically the federal government has not taken a strategic approach to address climate and environmental threats because resources and services are not prioritized based on need. And that risk assessment and that need-based should be how it would create a more equitable and access for communities that are at the highest threat level. So access to federal funds is a historic issue for many of our tribal communities. Our tribes and tribal organizations have had disadvantaged and sometimes completely excluded from national climate change resources and services because our small tribes and these communities that are under 400, 500 in population are competing against communities and tribal nations in the lower 48. So in the next few slides, we'll discuss the how and why this is happening. This graphic shows basically what communities face. On the bottom left, you see a safe and healthy community, and really that's all they want. They just want their community to be safe, and they want it to be healthy. And what they have to do is compete for grant funding, usually project specific, not a coordinated effort. And they face this brick wall of agencies. So each agency has their own requirements, their own limitations and so they're trying to match all these requirements, and they're getting a different scenario with each grant. For many communities, the current system is like trying to assemble a 10,000 piece puzzle without a picture printed on it and just figure it out as you go. The technical assistance needed for that because the capacity just isn't there. In some cases, it's just they don't have physical people that are available to work. And so they may have 1 or 2 or 3 people that are trying to maneuver this all by themselves. So this shows some of the initial first step, I would say, critical gap barriers. The other one is a lack of funding. There is no mechanism in place. Currently, the federal government, I would say the Biden administration, has addressed this to some extent to really look at what are we dealing with and provided funding flows that we're able to access. But this does not address the current estimated mitigation costs in Alaska. And this is over a 50-year period. If we were to just stop time today and address what we're currently dealing with. We have a huge, and you'll see along the North Slope, the Northwest Coast and the YK Delta, those coastal communities, because of the shift in the sea ice coverage, as well as being vulnerable and on the coast, those communities face really high management for climate threats. We estimate there's an $80 million annual funding gap over the next decade. And then preventing erosion, flooding, and permafrost-related disasters in the back end could save close to $26 billion in response and recovery costs. Currently, the federal government is set up as a response and recovery through FEMA, and you have to have particular documents in place and current before you could even access that FEMA funding. So as we identify these critical gaps, we want to make sure our communities are prepared to access the funding they need. Just 2 programs are currently designed specifically to support tribes that protect in place, do a managed retreat or relocation efforts. And we are currently working with our federal partners to address some of the other programs that may be available that just aren't structured for it to date. Limited local capacity. I did talk a little bit about that. This is Walter Nelson pictured. He is the Napakiak Managed Retreat Coordinator. This was during an emergency effort to decommission infrastructure due to rapid erosion. So Napakiak is one of 4 focus communities in the Center for Environmentally Threatened Communities program, and touches on the stop sign that we see in the graphic that was showed 2 slides ago, that you have a low capacity score. 1 person is low, and most places don't even have 1 coordinator. Small Alaska villages are often assumed to have administrative capacities like those in the lower 48 in municipalities, but in reality, they lack specialized planning, public works departments, administrative departments, grants departments. They are usually one person trying to handle and maneuver the whole lot. And this is at no fault of the community. This just shows that the technical assistance and the support for our communities is lacking. Additional funding is also necessary to hire and train community-based staff. And in Chapter 5 of the Unmet Needs Report, we talk in detail about that. So technical assistance. When you're the one person, in this case, Genevieve Brock in Qataliña, she states technical assistance has informed most of the recent decisions Qataliña has made to address coastal flooding and erosion. We would not be where we are at today without the outside support. And so this shows that when you're looking at relocation and you're looking at planning and land exchange and planning for our entire new community, imagine being the one person that is trying to work with your tribe and then work with all these different federal agencies without any technical support. It's almost impossible. So we need community-specific, multidisciplinary technical assistant teams that could support communities. And what that means is you need that architect, you need that construction manager, you need that grant person that can figure out what could go where and what grant funding could be used for what particular project. Because currently the federal programs such as BIA, Tribal Climate Resilience, EPA, and FEMA, they exclude or they make it very difficult for tribal organizations like ANTHC to support our communities. Their programs state that it has to come from the tribe itself. When the tribe is saying, we only have one person, we can't do this on our own, we need help. And basically the federal process is that you can't apply until you have help, but we can't help you. So some of the federal programs have offered technical assistance, and a lot of them contract to people in the lower 48 who don't understand Alaska. They don't understand that most of our communities are off the road system. Therefore, they look at it through the lens of anywhere else in the USA. And so it really isn't applicable for what our tribes need. So we need a technical assistant that is appropriate, that have skilled teams of Alaskans who understand Alaska and are dedicated to help our communities and meet them where they're at. Community-specific hazard data and analysis. Like I said previously, we're standing up a risk assessment program because this was one of the critical gaps that was identified. Until we have the information on erosion, flooding, and permafrost thaw, communities can't make informed decisions. They're basically making uninformed decisions because they don't have the modeling and engineering and analyses to really show what's going to happen, not only in the near term, but in the long term. And so we need data that is compiled into risk assessment reports so that it helps them make informed decisions. And then that would help them go into the planning stages where, again, you would need some type of technical assistance to help through that process so that you could choose if you're going to protect in place, retreat, relocate, or how you would prioritize actions, resources, and timelines. And then, of course, the next stage would be implementation to whatever your community chose to do. At the time of publication, staff from State of Alaska, ANTHC, and several federal agencies have started to develop a community risk assessment program to fill this critical gap. And we did meet just a couple of weeks ago with our federal partners and state partners at a tribal climate initiatives gathering in Anchorage to really discuss what would that look like if we used Alaska as the example to create a framework and create a better response system. And so we are making strides towards that. But currently, this is what agency coordination looks like. You're looking at all these different entities, and everybody has their own process and their own structure and their own programs, and communities have to figure it out. So the current support system to address climate change and environmental threats is immensely complex, inefficient, and ineffective. And so significant adjustments on how agencies collaborate are required to improve not only the accessibility, but the equity and the efficiency of their programs. So in the report, we offer 3 recommendations. If you have not read the report, the recommendations also have an Appendix C, calls out agencies by program, what works and what doesn't work, and offers some recommendations as to how to address those problems. So the first recommendation is a single funding source based on risk. Highest risk communities that have immediate threats, they need help first. And then again, help them fill that $80 million funding gap to either protect in place, retreat, or relocate. Currently, it's a competition game. And so we recommend the US Congress, 1, close the $80 million funding gap by providing a single committed funding source to fully cover the costs of protecting in place, managed retreat, or full relocation. And then to be effective, we recommend that the entity that receives the gap funding has Alaska-based staff and leadership that understands and can help communities with their infrastructure development and environmental threats. Because if we have somebody from Arizona trying to offer technical assistance and coordinate a project in Monarch, it's not going to work. One, they do it virtually, and sometimes the internet isn't stable, so they aren't getting accurate information. Another viable alternative to a single funding source is dedicated funding to multiple agencies who collaborate in a systemic, framework to respond with common priorities. So that would take some type of state and federal coordination effort. Funding priorities for Alaska's environmentally threatened communities. We need to really understand that this is a site-specific. We have critical gaps like relocating homes. There is no funding mechanism for that. Fixing infrastructure such as foundations on homes that are threatened. There is no funding mechanism for that. We also need community-specific data and to conduct these risk assessments. And then we need to train people. Rural Alaskans they will respond and adapt. Most of them have been in these same geographic spots on the planet for thousands of years. No different than my family. They're not gonna just go away, and they're not gonna move to Anchorage. Most of my family still lives in Northwest Arctic. I think there's 3 of us that have moved away. But really, these communities are committed to culture, place, and their land. And so we need to help them and meet them where they're at. And then remove those barriers to equity. It's not fair that communities have to compete against each other. Programs designed for small tribal and rural communities need to be specific in Alaska to meet our needs. Even the new funding through the BIL and the IRA and many of the programs, the existing programs weren't working. And basically what they did is fund programs that weren't working. And so they still aren't working, even though there's money there. The inequitable delivery of services is still a challenge. So in Appendix C in the report, it includes 30 pages that identify agency-specific barriers and then offers the recommendations. This is an example of one of those pages, an effective program, a beneficial program with potential, and then other relevant programs. So this basically shows you some of the programs that currently exist. Recommendation 3 is a whole of government implementation framework for Alaska so that our communities have the support and the technical assistance and the funding to be successful in their decisions and in their community health, and so they could thrive. And so they can make that decision to protect in place, do a managed retreat or relocate, and have a safe and healthy community. This is a proposed implementation framework. This was our discussion topic for the gathering a couple weeks ago. And really, what would this look like? We need to have our tribes at the table so that whoever they're working with at the state or at the government, federal government level, that they understand that everything is very site specific to that community. So you have to have a local person sitting at the table before the decisions are made. And so this is basically just a conceptual framework. How it would look, we're not sure, but this was just a process that really illustrates the framework by specific agency roles and responsibilities. And then it also includes the community, has a regional and local coordinator. The national significance to the report is if we could do it in Alaska for small communities, it could scale up. But if we can't protect our communities and our cultures in Alaska, which is the reason why the United States is an Arctic nation, then we're gonna have a really hard time in the future protecting the rest of the US. So it's critically important to protect our communities and cultures. Well, this presentation focuses primarily on infrastructure. In jeopardy are also not just the buildings, but the entire community. And when you lose your fish camps and your access to traditional ways of living, you are losing a piece of history and community that has been there for thousands of years. So we need to recognize that significance and address and identify those other critical gaps. But it's also an opportunity to act on urgent needs and plan for the future and utilize this as a test for innovative support systems that could be expanded on the nationwide level. Because this report was community focused and community led, we'd like to think of this as a comprehensive report as to how we take care of and value our traditional ways of living and apply them into innovative ways of supporting our communities. So really looking at those two worldviews and pulling them together and finding solutions for the future of our communities. We also have the National Strategy for the Arctic Region, which calls out that federal agencies should respond. Now we need to hold them accountable to this. Just recently, in the last few weeks, the National Strategy for the Arctic Region came out with their implementation plan. And that implementation plan includes some of the recommendations from the Unmet Needs Report, but none of them will be effective unless we hold each other accountable. And so really that's where we're at. We want to make sure that we improve the delivery and equitable services and funding mechanisms in place so our tribes can thrive as they face climate impacts. This is the QR code for the full report. And I will put my contact information in the chat. And then if you have any questions, I am available for questions. Okay, Anna.
Thank you so much, Jackie, and thank you everyone for attention. Please give Jackie a warm virtual round of applause, and thank you for a wonderful presentation. And we have now about 20 minutes for just sort of general Q&A. So if you have questions for Jackie about the report, you have a couple of options. You can put your question in the chat, and I will read it out loud with your name. You can, if you want to be anonymous, you can chat directly to me and I will read your comment without your name. Or if you prefer to talk than to type, you can raise your hand using the raise hand function, and that's under reactions on your Zoom toolbar. And I will invite you to come off mute. There's no advantage to one over the other. I'll switch back and forth between them. And I will kick off with a question that Anna Liljedahl put in the chat a few minutes ago, asking about that $4.5 billion cost estimate. To mitigate the current situation. She asks whether that estimate takes into account that many areas are off the road system. And so, you know, a 2x4 costs a lot more than.
Right. Well, plus, you know, the report was a couple of years in the making. So the estimates are actually pre-COVID. So when you think about that in itself, the supply line changed and impacted the cost of materials big time. And so, yes, taking into consideration that we are working off barges out of Seattle, timeframes which are unpredictable because of spring thaw and fall freeze. So we did take into consideration that most of our communities are off the road system.
Thank you. And then we have a question from Allison Chartrand asking whether the NCARS bill, that's the National Coordination on Adaptation and Resilience for Security, whether that addresses any of the recommendations in the report.
I don't know that it addresses anything directly. Since the report was published in January, we have had some discussions with the Ted Stevens Security Center and with the ADEC that just opened at UAA, but we haven't really focused on, most of our engagement has been directly with federal agencies that currently fund projects in rural Alaska. So I don't know that the bill actually addresses anything in particular, because this is focused on current infrastructure as it pertains to flooding, erosion, and permafrost melt. And I'm not familiar enough with the National Coordination on Adaptation, Resilience, Security, but with that report. But what I will say is that we are currently working very closely with the White House on other reports that actually call out things in the Arctic that don't necessarily align. And again, it's because our communities are very site specific. So I don't know that you could have one bill that will cover the whole United States and it'll actually be helpful for our rural communities. So yeah, I think we have a lot of work to do on the policy side as well.
Got a question from Michaela Stiff asking how tribes could work together to reduce some of the barriers to federal funding.
I don't know, when you look at, say, the Navajo Nation, we aren't set up like that. And a lot of times, if the funding mechanism doesn't say tribal organizations, it excludes compacts like AVCP and the YK Delta or Maniluk or any of our tribal health organizations or even ANTHC. So that's one of the barriers, is that not all funding requirements allow for tribal orgs to participate. So even if they banded together, it wouldn't matter. They're asking for tribe by tribe specific response. So the barrier is still there.
Thank you for the answer and for this great presentation.
Thanks, Michaela. We have a question that was chatted directly to me, which are what are some of the ways that communities are divided into the highest risk, high risk, and low risk categories right now? Who's deciding which categories or which communities are put in each category?
So the Denali Commission released a list of priority communities based on information that of just community engagement and working with agencies, other organizations like the State of Alaska and ANTHC that work in community. And they based the risks on some information that was available, some data on risk analysis from flooding and erosion, but most of it was based on community engagement. And so we used the Denali Commission list, which is, I think, currently in the process of getting updated. So that's how the priority in the report is referenced to, because that was the same list that the US government used in their GAO report in 2022. So the Denali Commission on their website has a list, and that's how it's prioritized. Is it the most accurate, and is it based on risk assessment and data? No, it's not. So currently we need more information in order to really create a comprehensive list and know what we're dealing with.
Thank you, Jackie. Corey, I see your hand is up. Go ahead.
Hi, Jackie. Thank you for the presentation. Good to see you. My question is about federal processes for identifying critical infrastructure. And, for instance, the example I'll give is, in Murbach, Qataliña loses half of their boats. What if you have a family of 10 people who rely on a boat and a fish rack pretty much to feed their family as their subsistence infrastructure? But if an outsider looked at it and saw it, maybe that's worth maybe $12,000-$15,000 max. However, that one boat and that one fish rack is probably worth to them much more than $1 million car for a millionaire. Is there any federal processes to have like a non-monetary approach or to scale how much a dollar means to people in the villages when you're doing the infrastructure assessment?
Yeah,
Non-monetary.
yeah, thanks for that question. No, that was certainly one of the questions that was posed. Murbach is a great example of a lot of lessons learned in one storm. And so FEMA, which we are currently in discussions with, they had to figure out all along the coast how to respond to infrastructure that was deemed recreational. So anywhere else in the US, again, this is where words matter, definition matters, value matters, because what is recreational, catching a trout as a recreation camping vacation in Minnesota is very different than subsistence in Alaska. So again, very specific to our way of living. And so those discussions are currently being had, and there is a lot to learn and a lot to share, because when it comes to economics and even doing valuation of current situations and subsistence food resources, we don't have that information. We have estimates, but we don't have dollar to dollar what that would look like. And so I think, again, it's going to be very site specific. What FEMA was able to do, though, unfortunately, it's not successful yet, but they were able to look at those fish camps and actually supply monetary value for replacement of some of the equipment. Unfortunately, Murbach hit late in the fall, and then a month later it was covered by snow and ice. And then by the time the process actually got here and they came to assess, they couldn't see anything. So it's hard to take people's, value just word of mouth that this is what I lost and this is what it means to my family. And so certainly, again, this is why it's so important that we call out these critical gaps in the process, because otherwise it'll never be through our lens. And so really this report is just the beginning of these discussions. And there are many other things that, are, in the case of Murbach, our lack of access to even counseling. There is no mental or behavioral health support system, even in the Western model, to help our kids understand that this is not the norm. This is not what every kid in America goes through. It's very unique to Alaska. And so we need to set up unique systems of response that are appropriate for our cultures and for our people and for our small tribal communities.
Thank you, Jackie, and thank you, Corey, for that question. So Anna has a question about slide 27, so I actually have it. I will pull it up real quick so that we can all see it. And once I find where my chat just moved to. All right, the question is, so this is the proposed framework that you discussed at a federal agency workshop a few weeks ago. And Anna Lily et al. Is asking how you envision researchers like data creators to contribute to this, this framework.
Well, first we have to get the state and the feds to create a framework. Then we can have that discussion, right? Here at under climate initiatives, under our Center for Climate and Health, that is where then we'd like to have that connector. Our program manager, Sarah Yoder, works really closely with Alaska Pacific University and the UA system. And so currently we have a lot of requests to collaborate, but when we don't know what we're dealing with, we're not quite set up to maneuver into that space just yet, right? So I'm not going to say that it's not possible, and it is certainly on our radar. I don't know what that would look like, but I do know it's important, because one of my discussions recently was scenario exercises, and ICER has funding and people who could do that. Well, we don't have the privilege of time to do scenario exercises with any of our communities, but so maybe there are better ideas, and maybe there's better technologies that we should be accessing, but we don't know that because we're an emergency response system right now. And so I think it's very important to recognize that we're going to need not only data creators and researchers, we're going to need visionaries. We're going to need people who could think outside the box and really sit down and say, is this really the appropriate infrastructure we want to rebuild for our communities when it didn't work before? Or what is that new infrastructure and what does it look like? So in this framework, this is just a conceptual idea. It was shared at the workshop that we had, but it really is conceptual. What works and how it's eventually laid out is going to take a lot more discussions.
Thank you. And I have we've got a question from, oh, sorry, lost my chat. Okay, there's a comment from Jeff Curry saying that federal response funding has historically been exclusively responsive, so knowing what you had before an event has been a challenge. No one goes around taking pictures of stuff that is working well before a storm occurs. Inventorying assets is part of the equation. Thankfully, recent aerial and remote sensing databases help prove what was there before an event. I don't know if Jackie, if there's anything you want to comment on that?
Yeah, I'll just add, our partnership is with NOAA, and we also have our local environmental observers network, which is under our Center for Climate and Health, really utilizing local observers to identify those things. And there's so much historical data that people now access on their phones. That's evidence. And, this is an evidence-based response system. But I will say that in talks with FEMA, they are looking at it through a different lens, and they're trying to figure out what do we do to change this so we're not just this emergency responder after the fact. I think there's a lot of discussions to still happen. And I'm going to just hop into Patricia's question. What are we doing about the physical, the social, emotional, and spiritual? That is near and dear to my heart. And I had flat out asked federal partners, like, you're sending out responders. Do you have, critical trauma response counselors with you? And they're like, no. And I'm like, well, do you offer them to anyone? And they say, yeah, we offer them to our team before they go. Well, you're preparing your responders, but you're not helping the community. So there are lots of critical gaps. I don't know that there is a Western process or system of response for the emotional and spiritual loss of fish camps. I think it's going to be a traditional revitalization of how we respond as Indigenous people. So really working closely with our food sovereignty program and our behavioral health program to look at what are those traditional methods that we could reintroduce as we move forward. So we're not just looking at Western replacement processes, we're looking at inclusion of traditional ways of living that we could evolve into better, healthier communities that were disrupted at contact. And so I really think that I hope we're on the right path, but it's going to take a lot more collaboration and a lot more effort to get us to the place that we want to be. So thanks for those questions. They're all great questions.
Thank you, Jackie, and thank you, Patricia, for that question. We have time for maybe one or two more questions if anyone would like to pose a final one. George, I see you coming off mute. Would you like to ask a question? Oh, your audio is not coming through. Perhaps try the chat.
Maybe I could just add one more thing while she's getting connected. You know, when it comes to youth, and to me, I see our youth as our future leaders in all our communities. So I really think that it's important to make sure that they're at the table of discussion, even if what they think is going to be helpful may not seem appropriate. I think as adults in a Western context, we don't include them enough. Whereas traditionally, I mean, that's most of my knowledge about all the changes in our world were because I was at the footsteps of my parents. And so I think it's really important to recognize that there is a place not only for youth to be there to hear these hard discussions, but there's also a place for them to infuse, because some of them are very wise beyond their years, probably some of the solutions that could be implemented that will help save us and help us onto a better path. So I just, yeah, I really think that, Patricia, you mentioned the youth. I think it's really, really important that we don't leave them out of the discussion.
Thank you, Jackie. I think that's a really, really great place to close the general Q&A section of this webinar. And thank you again for such a wonderful presentation and for answering all of these questions. So as Hazel noted in the chat, we do still have another 30 minutes in this this session, because we wanted to give you all the opportunity to have some more in-depth discussions focused on specific topics. So some of the IARPC collaboration teams are hosting specific breakout rooms for the next half hour or so. So those are